Alright, so I'm going to talk to you about right now are complex sentences. If you need to review simple sentences and compound sentences, you need to watch the other videos. Assuming you know what compound and simple sentences means in this video here. Let me give you those terms again. A subject, what the sentence is about. A verb is the action the subject is doing. Or a clause is a group of words. We have independent clause, meaning it's a sentence that can be by itself. We have a dependent clause, meaning it needs to add something in order for it to make sense. So even though it has a subject and a verb, it needs something to make it make better sense. So what a complex sentence is, a complex sentence contains one independent clause and one dependent clause. So, John cannot set up his typewriter. This is an independent clause. It's a sentence, it makes sense by itself, it'd be perfect. Because the wall has no outlet, that is a dependent clause. Now, although it has a subject and a verb, since it has the word because in the beginning, it doesn't really give us enough information. So if you just read a sentence that said, because the wall has no outlet, it wouldn't really make sense. So that's a dependent clause. It needs something to clarify its meaning. So we have independent clause, dependent clause, and then the word because is your subordinating conjunction, which is creating that to being an independent clause. Okay? A dependent clause, excuse me. So a dependent clause is a group of words, contains a subject and a verb, but does not express a complete thought. And a lot of times they'll use these dependent marker words. When Jim studied in the sweet shop for his chemistry quiz, now that's not a complete thought. There is a subject, there is a verb, but it's incomplete thought. So we need to add to it. We need an independent clause to make that make sense. Okay? When, again, is your dependent marker. You need to add something like, it was very noisy. So when Jim studied in the sweet shop for his chemistry quiz, it was very noisy. Now you have a complex sentence. And here are some of the common dependent markers. After, although, as if, because, before, even. Okay, and you can read the rest. A complex sentence has an independent clause with one or more dependent clauses. Again, note, if your dependent clause is in the beginning of your sentence, you need a comma. Since we got to the concert late, comma, we had to make our way to our seats. All right? The dependent clause is the beginning because of that word since, and your independent clause is at the end, so you need a comma. In contrast, if your independent clause is at the beginning of your sentence, then you do not need a comma. We left class early so that we could attend a special lecture. So if you go to the before so part, we left class early. That is an independent clause. So that we could attend a special lecture is a dependent clause. And that would make it a complex sentence, but you don't need the comma. All right, just to reiterate, there is a dependent clause at the beginning of a sentence. There's an independent clause at the second half of the sentence, so you need a comma. Okay. Again, just to reiterate, independent clause, dependent clause, no comma. We left class early so that we can attend a special lecture. We don't need a comma in that complex sentence. A dependent clause, independent clause, so that we could attend a special lecture, comma. We left class early. That would need a comma. Now let's just compare. Compound sentences are different from complex sentences in one important way. In terms of structure, it refers to compound sentences are two independent clauses that are combined by a coordinated conjunction. Meaning that if you took that comma away, you still would have two independent thoughts. Now a complex sentence is if you took that conjunction away, it's not a comma away. You wouldn't have two complete thoughts. Now why is this important? Well, compound sentence, what the writer is telling us is that both independent clauses and everything in that sentence is equally as important. In a complex sentence, the independent clause is more important. So let me show you some examples. We have, John was tired, but he finished his homework. Now that would be a compound sentence. Complex, although John was tired, he finished his homework. So, if we look at this, we can see that a compound sentence It is both equally as important that John was tired, let me move up here, and that he also finished his homework. All right, in a complex sentence, the fact that he was tired is not as important as the fact that he finished his homework. So we can assume that the writer is going to be spending the rest of the paragraph talking about how he finished his homework. All right, just be careful of the long rambling sentences. Like I said, writing and speaking are two separate modes of communication. Right, so it doesn't matter how long your sentences are. These long rambling sentences like this one, it don't make any sense. All right, we need to make sure that our grammar is good and that our sentences are broken up. All right? If you need to look back at the example, you're more than welcome to. So you can improve things by adding a few interesting phrases. So I thought of this poem while I was watching my dog play. Again, not bad, but let's improve it. I thought of this poem while I was watching my dog play. Instead, you can say, watching my dog play, I thought of a great idea for a poem. It just adds a little more element, a better formality, a better grammar, and it communicates better, what happened. So in this sentence, what you want to see is that while watching my dog play is a independent clause. All right? I thought of a great idea for a poem is independent clause. But now if we added like a word at the beginning here, while watching my dog play, I thought of a great idea for a poem. Now you just created this to be an dependent clause. So now what you're telling your reader is that this fact that you're watching your dog play is not as important as the idea of that you got a great idea for a poem. So the rest of what you're going to write about is this great idea for a poem. Again, another example you can read through. My mom wrote this poem for me. It's about childhood. What would you do to improve it? Well, let me take a look at this. One thing that make it simple is that you can just put a semicolon in between the two independent phrases. Oops. Go back. Sorry. All right, here we go. So what I would do is I would just put a semicolon right here and try and draw this right. There we go. Something like that. Make it a little more formal. Or you can make one more of a dependent clause because it's not as important. Although my mom wrote this poem for me, comma, it's about childhood. So you're telling your reader that it's more important to understand that the poem is about childhood, not necessarily that my mom wrote it. Okay? Here's another one. My friend Sabrina wrote this poem for me. She told me that her cat inspired her to write it. Again, if you want to keep it as compound, you can do, after me, you can put, oops, comma, and then insert and. All right, now you got compound. But if you want to make it complex, because you want one part to be more important than the other, you could say something that, like, instead of, you can write the beginning of she. Let's see, we'll do that. You can write, let me write this down here. Although she told me that her cat inspired her to write it, then we put the comma after it. And then we move this in the front. So the sentence would read, although she told me that her cat inspired her to write it, comma, my friend Sabrina wrote this poem for me. Now you're telling the reader that's more important to understand that the friend Sabrina wrote this poem for you. So that's part of the decision-making process of a writer in terms of what kind of sentences they would like to write in terms of expressing what they want to say. Okay, again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email right on Canvas. Let us know if you want to check to see if you're editing properly. Again, just write on Canvas, let us know, and keep in touch.